Arthur Erickson is to architecture what John Lennon was to pop music. Supremely talented, driven to perfection, and totally unpredictable. Both men are famous for their legacies. Arthur's first love was his painting. His interest in architecture began after several years' service in World War II. Following the war, he contemplated a diplomatic career, but decided instead to be an architect. What then followed were years of world travel in the 50s and 60s, studying great architecture. What he learned in those travels formed the basis for almost all of his body of work.
I always felt that the important things were the conceptual ideas, not the details, even in school. And I had very strong attitudes about art, and I remember the only time I was taken to the principal was when I refused to draw a daffodil the way the art teacher wanted it.
How did you want to draw it?
Well, I felt it was, I told him it was a silly exercise, you see, and he became very upset and marched me down to the principal.
Did they
and I refused to compromise. It was a very difficult situation.
Vancouver at that time was a very bustling city, young, and you had many different directions that you could have gone in terms of a career. How did you make your choices at that point?
I always felt that my life led me. I didn't lead my life, you know. It was, things were put in my path inevitably, and I did have a talent as an artist, as a painter, very young, and I was fascinated by it, and I thought I'd like to pursue that, but everybody discouraged me. As you know, that was, you could use as a hobby, but not as a profession.
What did your father want you to do?
He wanted me to do something that was practical, and he felt that if I did have that leaning and that talent, the best thing would be architecture. One of my mother's friends brought the Fortune magazine that had the first publication of Frank Lloyd Wright's Desert House, and I looked at it and said, look, if an architect can do that, I'm going to be an architect. What I'd thought up until that time was that architecture was much too technical and much too restrictive, and that you would not be able to be as creative. And obviously that Desert House was an extraordinary statement, and I saw that you could be completely creative in architecture. I worked with several offices in Vancouver, and I guess I was fired from all of them eventually, as being absolutely useless.
You could be found walking through the offices with large French bread under your arm, breaking it off and munching and leaving crumbs all over people's desks. No wonder they turfed you.
Well, exactly. I think in MacArthur and Nairn, which was a very, very strict, very proper office at that time, and they really objected because the drawer that you kept all your instruments in, you know, I usually had this loaf of bread and a bottle of wine and a bit of cheese, which had been my diet in the Mediterranean. Sticking out of it, and of course they all had very carefully wrapped sandwiches, and
you were
You
were never going to fit in.
No.
Since 1954, Arthur Erickson has created a vast body of work. In Vancouver, for example, the Robson Square Courthouse Complex. In Toronto, the Roy Thompson Hall. In Washington, the Canadian Embassy. And many, many more around the world. If one theme runs through his work, it's Erickson's strong respect for nature. SFU, however, remains his first great work and the one that single-handedly changed his life and Canadian architecture. Surprisingly, up until that point, he and his then-partner, Jeffrey Massey, had designed nothing larger than a house.
I think from a house you learn everything. The scale of the house, the detail, the complexity, it's as great as you ever find in any other building. And it gives you, I think it gives you a very solid base for doing larger structures and working with cities and things like that. I think if you can do a house, you can do anything.
I think on behalf of everybody watching and those of us in the room, we'd like to thank you for the Museum of Anthropology.
Thank you. I always hope to learn from every project we do, and that was such a wonderful opportunity to look into the arts and crafts of the Northwest people, and that was really the inspiration of it.
You didn't not only have to deal with the people present, but you had to deal with the ancestors.
Yes.
And the myths.
Oh, yes. And the sense of reverence which they had about the land, which we too often don't have. My problem is that it's been so easy to travel, and there's always been that lure of other lands, working in other places, and always that fascination in other cultures. And I guess that's been my Achilles heel, because it doesn't make sense to work in other places, but you know, you're challenged, and
Why did you choose to make your home Vancouver?
you know, Vancouver always draws you. I mean, it's insidious in its attraction. I think everybody has this kind of love-hate relationship with the city that they become terribly frustrated with it, and yet in its best conditions of weather, and it's so extraordinarily beautiful, and you always have that hope for it, you know, having been born here and everything else, that somehow we as the denizens of the city can live up to what the city offers in its physical setting.
Life has set up a number of interesting roadblocks for Vancouver crooner Kenny Colman. But tenacious is Kenny's middle name, and neither the emergence of the Beatles at a crucial time in his career nor a major illness was enough to make him veer off the path to stardom. In 1985, after doctors told him he had terminal cancer, Kenny gave away all his earthly possessions and prepared to die. Luckily, the diagnosis proved incorrect, and after surgery, Kenny went straight back to work. These days, his teenage son, Chase, is the light of his life and the inspiration behind Kenny Colman, the last of the saloon singers.
The dream began when I got into radio, I think, really. I always, when I was very young, the music of my peers, or growing up as a teenager in Vancouver and earlier in Winnipeg, where I was born and raised here in Vancouver, I used to listen to Count Basie, Duke Ellington. That was the music that I was hearing on the radio. At that time, believe it or not, I never thought of singing or anything. Sports and sports was everything I loved. Hockey, softball, lacrosse, anything competitive, which I think that show business I've discovered is also quite competitive. But I found that at parties I would try to imitate Frankie Lane or Nat King Cole, different Mel Torme, but not in person. I would go into a closet and they would close the door, and I would do it there because I was too shy to sing in front of people. A lot of people aren't going to believe that, but it's true, you know. And I went to Prince George to play hockey. And just to make it very brief, I got a job as a disc jockey. And having the job as a disc jockey really surrounded me with music, you know. And they used to have the Paul Weston, Percy Faith, Montavani records. And I would sing over the record.
Tonight won't be just any night. Tonight there will be no morning star. Tonight, I'll see my love tonight, and for us, stars will stop.
You learn how to sing by hanging out piano bars. You hang out in clubs, and you know 2 or 3 songs that you can sit in with and you can get up with, and you sing every night in New York. While I was working for the game shows, Goodson and Todman at the time, every night I was singing in clubs, getting up and singing standards with jazz trios, because they were filled. This was the early 60s in New York, and it was filled with trios and jazz. And I think I never took I never took lessons. I took it by paying my dues, by doing it and being there. I think that's the only way.
Were your parents encouraging in your career?
Coming from immigrant parents, my father from Russia, my mother from Romania, they really, in terms of growing up in Winnipeg, the North End, my parents were only interested in one thing: survival and feeding us and trying to get us to better ourselves and get a job, get a steady job, and be happy and content, get married very young. And that surely wasn't me.
It was just one of those things, just one of those crazy flings, one of those bells that now and then rings, just one of those things.
I never went into show business thinking of making money and pursuing it. But boy, I'll tell you one thing, I've met Muhammad Ali. I performed in Monte Carlo this past year for Prince Albert and the royal families. It has afforded me the opportunity to really meet a lot of great people, and that's terrific.
You've really paid your dues, I think, haven't you? They told you had 6 months to live at one point. How does that make you feel now?
I think I pursue my career with a little more intensity. I get involved more. I care more. I think I take my life more precious. And I thank God every night before I go to bed. And I mean this. Every night I say thank you. And I thank him for this opportunity to keep going. But I owe it to that kid that we saw on television, and I owe it to the kid younger than he was in New York when I went there in the late 59, 58, when I was in Bermuda, 57, 58, and 60s when I went there you pay your dues. But I owe it to that person to keep going, and I'm going to keep singing until there's nothing left. You know, I believe in it.
Kenny spent most of the past year singing at Lowe's Hotel in Monte Carlo, a gig arranged for him by Frank Sinatra.
Arthur Erickson has just been contracted to design and develop a cultural complex in Shanghai, China, where